Okay, I'm Cindy Kelly, Atomic Heritage Foundation, and it is Thursday, April 6th, 2017 in Washington, D.C., and I have with me Abe Krash. And first thing I want to do is ask him to say and then spell his full name.
Abe Krash, A-B-E-K-R-A-S-H.
Thank you. So you've had some very interesting experiences in your life.
Indeed.
A long and illustrious career as a lawyer. But what we want to focus on, just to start, is your years during World War II when you were a student at University of Chicago. Maybe you want to tell people a little bit about where you were born and how you got to Chicago.
All right, fine. I think that's a good place to begin. Well, I came to the college at the University of Chicago in the fall of 1944. I was 17 years old. The war was, of course, still on. I'd grown up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and I'd had an uncle who had been at the university years before, and so my high school principal said, "Go east, young man." So I came to the University of Chicago. Shortly after I came there, a few weeks after I came, I went over to the offices of the student newspaper, the Chicago Maroon, which were then located in a prefab building back of what's now the President's House. And I applied to be a reporter, and I was immediately taken on. I had a rather unusual journalistic experience. What happened was first of all, I was the editor of the high school student newspaper, the Lariat. But more significantly, there was a morning newspaper in Cheyenne called the Wyoming Eagle. And when I was about in the 10th grade, I began to write some stories about the high school teams for the paper. And when I was in the 11th grade, the reporter went off to the war, the sports editor went off to the war. And I became the sports editor when I was in the 11th grade. And I came to the newspaper office every day and wrote articles and had a column and began to learn something about the newspaper. So by the time I came to the Maroon, I really had for a young fellow of 17, I'd had quite a bit of background in journalism. In any event, I became a reporter for the Maroon, which was a weekly paper. And in the winter of 1945, the editor of the newspaper left, probably I think to go off to the war. And there was an election for a new editor, and I was elected. Now, I was only a freshman, but you have to understand it was the wartime, and so many of the older people were gone. But so, in any event, I was elected editor of the Maroon. And shortly after I became the editor, I decided I wanted to have profiles written about various distinguished faculty members. The Maroon was a weekly paper, and we would have, each week I'd write a profile of a different distinguished member of the faculty. So sometime early in April of 1945, I asked one of the reporters for the paper, I said, "Look, let's do a profile, an article about Arthur Compton, C-O-M-P-T-O-N. Compton was the dean of the Division of Physical Sciences at the University of Chicago. He'd also won the Nobel Prize in physics, I believe in the 1920s. Unbeknown to me, he was the director of the Manhattan Project at Chicago. I didn't know that. When I became the editor of the paper, I was told by a man by the name of Morgenstern, who was the director of public relations, a very fine person. He said to me, "Look, don't write any articles about things going on in several of the buildings of the university." He identified that those buildings, you could see military guards were in front of those buildings. All he told me, as I recall, was that there was some type of government research, military research going on, but he didn't describe it more than that. But he just said, "Don't write anything about those." And I faithfully obeyed that injunction. In any event, the reporter wrote this article about Arthur Compton, which appeared, the paper came out on a Friday. And we had an editor's meeting on Saturday morning to prepare for the following week's edition. And I came to the office there on Saturday morning, and in mid-morning I received a phone call, and the person at the other end identified himself either as Captain or Major so-and-so he said from military intelligence, and he said he had probably wanted to come and see me. I thought it was a gag, and from one of my friends at the university resident halls. But in any event, about an hour later, two guys show up, and they pull out from their pocket an identification, and sure enough, it was a Major so-and-so and a Captain so-and-so. And we sat down in my little office, the little editor's office, and the Major began by saying that we had the Maroon had committed a violation of the regulations governing newspapers and publications. You might have to bear in mind, I didn't have the foggiest idea what he was talking about. I'd never dealt with such regulations or knew anything about them. And while we were talking, the circulation manager of the Maroon poked his head in the door and said he wanted to tell me that all of our papers had been picked up. The newspaper was free, was distributed throughout the campus. And the Major, as I recall, cleared his throat and said, well, he said he had to tell me that the military had gone around the previous night and picked up every single paper throughout the campus and also gone to the printer and destroyed the plates. And I was puzzled, but throughout, you didn't know what we had done. He said he couldn't tell me much more. And he said, of course, they were concerned about a recurrence. And even at the tender age of 17, I realized if I didn't know what we had done, it would be difficult to avoid being a recidivist. But I didn't have the foggiest idea what he was talking about. And he said they had arranged for me, this was Saturday morning, he said they had arranged for me on the following Monday morning to see the dean of the college, who was a man by the name of Lawrence Kimpton, later the president of the university. And so on Monday morning, I went over to Cobb Hall, which was where the dean's office was. I had previously dealt with him as the editor, and from time to time we'd had occasion talked about things I needed for stories and so forth. And he'd been very friendly with me, so he knew me. And he had spread out at his desk a copy of the Maroon, which was an 8-page paper. Anyway, he had it spread out in front of on his desk. And he said, well, you gave us you gave the administration quite a headache over the weekend. And I said, well, these guys had come to see me, and I didn't have the foggiest idea what this was all about. And he said, he turned to there was the article about Compton, and he said, you see the article about Compton? I said, yes. And he pointed to one sentence in the article, which said in substance that Compton had been engaged in research about breaking the atom. That in substance was what we said. Now, bear in mind that sentence would have come from the university's public relations files, where our reporter went to find out about Compton. So it was no great secret. But in any event, she wouldn't have known that. And then he said, we have concluded that we need to tell you something, because he said we don't want to shut down the Maroon, but we want to be sure nothing happens again that's a problem. And he then told me, he said the following, that I remember this very vividly. He said, the reason that the military people came to see me was they were concerned that enemy agents, German or Japanese agents in Chicago, might read the Maroon, and from that might get a clue as to what was going on at the university and the military research. And he said, we've concluded we need to tell you something. And he then said the research involved, he says, they are engaged here in developing a great new weapon which will revolutionize warfare. That's exactly what he said to me. He did not say, he did not use the words atomic weapon, but he said a great new weapon that will revolutionize. I remember this very vividly, very accurately. And unbeknown to me, Kimpton was also the personnel director of the Manhattan Project, but I didn't know that. And he didn't tell me that Compton was the head of the Manhattan Project. There was nothing like that. But he said, look, you have to be careful not to mention anything about the research going on. And it was a very cordial conversation. He said they didn't want to shut down the Maroon. He said he enjoined me not to tell anybody. But just bear in mind that they were concerned about that. So I left the office, and I did violate his injunction by talking to my good friend, my very close friend, Alan Strauss, Strauss, who was the business manager and who was majoring in chemistry. And I thought he might have some idea as to what this was about. And Strauss, I told him, he said he didn't have the foggiest idea either. And so I said, fine. And about a couple of weeks later, Compton was named to be the president of Washington University in St. Louis. And that, of course, was a big news story for the Maroon. And about the middle of the week, I got a call again from this major from military intelligence, and he said, I assume you're going to be writing a story about Compton. I said, absolutely. And he said, well, we want to come and see you. And here I am. I was 17 years old, the editor of the student. I drew myself up, and I said, well, I'd have to put a slug line under the headline, passed by military censor. And I remember there was a long moment of silence, and he then said, that would not be a good idea. And it suddenly dawned on me that if that I became the editor of a paper that was shut down. And in any event, in about a little while, I said I'd show him the article, of course. And he came out and he sat down at a desk in the Maroon offices and he read it. He didn't change a comma. He said the article was fine, and we read the article about Compton becoming the president of Washington University, St. Louis. Here I was, of course, in possession of one of the greatest scoops of the 20th century, but what Kimpton told me, but I couldn't say anything about it, needless to say. Then this would have been in May of 1945. The war is still on. And on VE Day, we put out a special edition, and we arranged, Robert Hutchins came to speak at Rockefeller Chapel on occasion of VE Day. We had it was a big event. And I went home for the summer, and the school year ended in June. I went home. I lived then in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and I went home. And in July, the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. And that was the first that I had then dawned on me what Kimpton was telling me when he said they were working on a great, and I then realized this was what he was trying to talk to me about. But that was the first time I realized what the implications of what they were talking about. A couple of years later, this is now 1945, sometime in the late 40s, the New Yorker magazine ran an article about security violations in connection with the Manhattan Project. And in the article, there's a paragraph or two. They said, sometime in they said the schoolboy editors at the University of Chicago had created quite a tizzy, they said, at the intelligence office, at the Chicago office of military intelligence. And they described this incident in a couple of paragraphs. And reflecting on it later, I thought this was all frankly kind of preposterous if you stop to think about it, that anybody would find anything out by reading that article. You must remember that there was, at the university, first of all, there were military guards in front of these buildings parading back and forth, so it was obvious to anybody just walking, you'd see that there was something going on. But more significantly than that, if you went into what was called the Reynolds Club, which was which is a big dining hall of the university, if you would go there for lunch, for example, or even for dinner, and you would see there Enrico Fermi, Leo Szilard, some of the most distinguished physicists in the world were there having lunch. And obviously they were not there engaged in research on the Canterbury Tales. I mean, here were some of the most famous scientists in the world were at the university, and you would see them. I mean, there was no, and you would know certainly who they were. Fermi taught classes in one of them which I took. So the notion that somehow that they would certainly know, anybody who would know that something was going on at the university. If you see people of that great distinction like Szilard, Fermi, all these guys were engaged to work there. But in any event, I was told by Kimpton, I was told that there was this great new weapon. Again, he did not say, as I say, he did yet use the word atomic. That was something we learned much later, but he did say a great new weapon, which will and he was described it very vividly, and I was a very, with a very clear impression of it. So that is the story of how I knew in 1945 about the atomic bomb before it was dropped. And of course, years later, when I had occasion some years later, when I was invited to Chicago to come out for a reunion, I told this story and created great hilarity. And I never heard anything further about it. I did have, as I mentioned, one of the courses I was obliged to take as a student in the college was called the Physical Sciences Survey course. And I went one day to one of the classes, the lecturer was Fermi. And I didn't know who he was. But these people were all around, but that was all I knew. So anyway, that is the story of my knowledge about the atomic bomb.
It's marvelous. They never said this is the line that's the offensive line. It could have been any part of our report on Compton. I mean, you didn't know what triggered their.
Well,
did you figure it out?
What triggered their concern was the story was, very, very straightforward about just Compton. Didn't tell a heck of a lot about Compton. I don't recall all the details. I'm sure we would have talked about the fact that he won the Nobel Prize and was head of the Division of Physical Sciences. There was the one sentence which said that he was engaged in doing research on breaking the atom. But let me say, every physicist in the world who was worth anything at that time was engaged in that kind of research. I mean, throughout the world. So you were saying that somebody of the stature of Compton, who was a very distinguished physicist, that he was doing this. Of course, he was doing that. That's what physicists were doing in the mid-1940s, and so it really didn't say anything. So why they were stirred up about it, I'm not, still, even 60, 70 years later, I'm still puzzled because, as I say, I think the notion that somehow this would have been a tip-off to anybody is kind of ridiculous. There were so many other ways in which, if you wanted to know what was going on, it was perfectly obvious that there were things going on at the University. You wouldn't know just from the fact that if you were some kind of enemy agent, you would see Fermi or Szilard. You wouldn't know exactly, but you certainly would discern that there was something going on in these buildings. So anyway, that is really the story.
So one of the things we're doing for our project is actually creating a walking tour of sorts, so that people will be standing in front of Eckhart Hall and Ryerson.
Yes, well, Eckhart and Ryerson were the University of Chicago is of course you know, is the quadrangle, has been the major buildings. At that time, now it's greatly expanded, but at that time they were the quadrangles, and Eckhart and Ryerson were buildings where physical sciences were buildings, and that's where these guys had their offices and were doing some work. Now, of course, they're also doing work. They was doing work in Stagg Field, Stagg Field was a football field, and which was a couple blocks away from those buildings, and it was a football stadium, and it was there in Stagg Field, in the locker rooms of the gym there, where Fermi did the first chain reaction. Of course, I didn't know anything about that.
Tell me about again. Can you describe the military soldiers walking back and forth in front of Eckhart and Ryerson?
Yes. There were, guards walking back and forth. And now, those were the only few buildings. The other buildings at the university, there was nobody there, as far as I can recall at this point. But there were military guards in front of those buildings. Yes, there were.
Do you remember there's a tree that was on the green, on the lawn, maybe 50 feet from the steps of Eckhart. And it was called the Council Tree. And this may have been named after you were there, but according to legend, the Manhattan Project scientists who feared that even the halls were bugged or could have been bugged by spies, if they had something that they wanted to talk about in confidence, confidentially, they would go under this tree on the lawn.
Well,
Did
that I didn't know about. I do know, as I had mentioned earlier, I was told by the public relations director, Mr. Morgenstern, that he did tell me. He said, "Look, there is military research." I think he used the word military, or government research going on in these buildings, but he didn't say anything more than that. I mean, he didn't describe the nature of the research or anybody who was there or identify any of the people there. He just told me we said that I should avoid, the Maroon should avoid saying anything about those buildings, which of course we did. We never said anything about that.
So did you pass that along to your colleagues on the staff or
no? No, I didn't. After I came back from talking to Kimpton, he'd said, "Look, you've got to keep this very secret and confidential." And I did breach that to a very, very, very limited extent by talking to Mr. Alan Strauss. As I say, he was a very close friend, and he was the business manager, and he was a major in chemistry. And I thought, well, he was a scientist, a student in science, so I thought, whereas I wasn't, and I thought he would maybe the information which he could shed some light on it and explain it to me, but he was not able. He said he didn't understand it either, and neither one of us ever spoke to anybody about it. No, we strictly adhered to the injunction that we keep it secret. We didn't appreciate what it was all about really until several months later, in July, when the bomb was dropped, and then of course I fully appreciated what Kimpton was saying to me.
Right. Actually, the Hiroshima bomb was dropped in August.
Okay, well then I thought it was the end of July, but August.
Right.
Yeah, but that was when I first became aware, reading the newspaper. I said, "This is what Kimpton was talking to me about."
And it's interesting, the only other call you had from security was when they suspected you might be writing another article about Compton.
When he was becoming the president of Washington University, St. Louis. And we did write an article, and they came and they looked at it. I mean, he sat down, this military officer sat down at the desk at the Maroon offices. I gave him the article, which we were going to publish, and he read it, and he was very pleasant. He said, "It's fine, no problem." He didn't change a comma. We didn't say anything about breaking the atom, and we ran the article, and that was that. I mean, but that was a big story for us. But he didn't bother us in any other way, and the newspaper went on.
You mentioned that Fermi had taught a class. Did others of these illustrious scientists?
Oh well, Fermi taught. There was a Physics 101 class for people who were going to become physicists, chemists, medical students, and he taught that introductory course and was renowned as an exceptionally good teacher for introductory students. He does. What the class I went to was in the physical sciences survey, and here he was, and I assure you, I didn't have the foggiest idea that this was one of the world's most distinguished physicists. When he gave a lecture, maybe one or two lectures, I outlined, you have to understand that at the University of Chicago at that time, and I even think, I don't know it's continued, I think, many of the most distinguished faculty members taught classes in the college. That way, I had, for example, that was true of, there was Frank Knight, who was a very famous economist, taught introductory classes. He lectured, I remember. I had my social science class was with David Reisman, who later became a very distinguished sociologist, Daniel Bell. So many of the most distinguished, there was a tradition at the university that major members of the faculty, people who were very distinguished in their fields, would teach college classes, and that was was a great treat to have them. The University of Chicago was a very special place.
You talked about the curriculum being, no electives. At least your first 2 years, is that right?
Yes, and if you came, well, when I came, you have to appreciate there was what was called the Hutchins College, which began with the 11th grade. That's when college, but I came as a conventional freshman, like if I were going to any college, which you were admitted then too. When you came, you took what were called placement exams to see, what your level of knowledge was, and I took those. And anyway, in the college at that time, all of the courses for people like me coming conventional were prescribed. There were no electives. I mean, you took physical sciences, social sciences, humanities, biological sciences, and we took them for 2 years, and it was a wonderful education, because it was what went on was you taught in small classes of 20, 25 students, with an occasional supplement by occasional lecture, larger lecture, but basically in very small classes, and you didn't have text, you're reading always original texts. They didn't have textbooks, but you were reading original things, the great books. That's what we're reading, and we would come to classes and discuss those. And so, and many of the teachers followed the Socratic or quasi-Socratic method of teaching, and it was teaching by discussion. And there were some marvelous teachers there at that time. One of the most famous was a man by the name of Joe Schwab, who was also a scientist, and I remember his class was just extraordinary. But that was the education at the University of Chicago, in the college at that time. And at the end of the second year, you then got a bachelor's degree, and then I went to law school from there. But since I was only a 2-year student, I had to go to law school for 4 years instead of 3 conventionally, maybe go an additional year.
Can you talk about Hutchins and what kind of president he was?
Oh, well. Hutchins remains one of my all-time favorite people. I have a picture of him in my office, as a matter of fact, that he gave me. He was a charismatic person, and his father had been a minister, and Hutchins himself was a superb orator, and he would give these just incredibly good speeches. They were, as I realized later, they were always practically the same thing. About his speeches were about the values of a liberal education and what a university should be. Hutchins was great because of the questions he asked about what a university should be doing, and he had a very clear idea in mind about the relationship between research and teaching, and he was just a very charismatic figure, really. I remember inviting him to give the talk at the VE Day, and he came in, and it was just extraordinary. And I went to a number of his. Whenever he talked, I would want to go listen to hear what he had to say. And as I say, I came to realize he basically was always saying the same thing, essentially, in somewhat different words, but he was always speaking. I remember one of his most famous lectures began, he said, a university is a community of scholars. It's not a country club. It's not a glee club. It's a community of scholars. And he was an exciting person, and he was a stand-up guy. That's why many of us admired him. the Illinois legislature was investigating the university because of alleged communist influences. A number of us went down to watch him testify. He was amazing. He was so good that when he turned around, the guy questioning him, he turned around, he was asking the questions, and the guy questioning him was responding. That's how Hutchins was very quick-witted, very extraordinary, witty, and eloquent, and he was, to many of us, he was really kind of a hero.
So it's been told he's the one who eliminated football. Is that right, at Chicago?
Well, what happened was Chicago, the University of Chicago was a member of the Big Ten as it was constituted. That's now changed, but at that time. And in the early years of the last century, Chicago was a great football power because they had a coach, Amos Alonzo Stagg, was the Stagg Field was named after him. And he was a great coach. And Chicago recruited good players but then in the 20s, beginning around the 20s, I believe, the university adopted a policy that everybody admitted had to be admitted under the same standards. In other words, there were no such things as athletic scholarships. If you came, you had to be a student like everybody else and admitted to the same basis, take the same classes. And once you did that, you could no longer really effectively compete because the other schools recruited athletes who couldn't possibly have passed those exams and been students. In the same way, they just weren't. And this continued into the 30s, and Chicago was getting really badly beaten by the other teams. I think that in the mid-30s they still did have there was a fellow by the name of Jay Berwanger who was an All-American player. But Chicago was really outclassed by other schools who had different recruitment, who would recruit athletes, qua athletes, not as students. And finally, Chicago was beaten, I think, by the University of Michigan football team by like a score of 73-0. And Hutchins came into the locker room and said, "I'm going to make sure this never happens again." And what he did, he came to the board of trustees and said, "Look, we should quit. We just can't compete with this," and we just couldn't. So they dropped it. They competed at the level at which they could. While I was at the university, at the college, the Chicago Bear football team was up for sale, the professional team, and there was some talk that the university should buy the football team, buy the Chicago Bears. That would be our football team. We would have beaten the hell out of every team in the country if we'd had bought the Bears, but they didn't. Unfortunately, they didn't. So Chicago ceased to be a major athletic power. But that was really, Hutchins just recognized that the realities that they could not compete because of the academic policies that they followed, unlike other universities.
So that meant, and to set the stage for the Manhattan Project, that meant that the field was abandoned and the stands were...
Well, Stagg Field, no, actually it was not abandoned. There was intramural play on the... I remember playing intramural games there, going there. In fact, I was a referee in something. No, the field was still active. And Bartlett Gymnasium, which is built right just next to the field that's called Bartlett Gymnasium, we went there to work out or play basketball, intramural basketball. So it was all the facilities were all being used, but Chicago was Chicago did play basketball at a different level. No longer couldn't compete in the Big Ten, where the teams were just exceptionally good players, but Chicago couldn't compete. But they did have basketball. They played, but so it was still a facility that was being used in my time anyway.
In the squash courts, I wonder, it must have, I think, cordoned those off for scientific research or something. They wouldn't have had.
I never knew anything about that.
Right,
No, I didn't know anything about that.
They were used for the.
Yeah, I never knew. There's now a statue. There is a statue in front of the of what were the skulls. There is a statute saying here was the first chain reaction. I believe there's a statue there now. I've passed it by. I think it's still there.
Yes, it is. It is.
But the University of Chicago was really an extraordinary place. I mean, in my time, and of course remained so, it was really a very intellectually very exciting place. For a boy from Cheyenne, believe me, it was really quite a new world.
So why don't you give us a little sense about your own childhood and what you did after this great expose of atomic research?
Well, I went to the law school after the college at the University of Chicago, and since I had come out of a 2-year college, I was required, unlike people who came from other universities who'd been at 4-year students, they could go to law school in Chicago for 3 years, but I and my fellow students who came out of the college, we were required to go 4 years. So I went to the college at the law school 4 years, and then I went to the Yale Law School as a graduate fellow for a year in 1949, 1950. And from Yale, I came to Washington, and I worked for 2 years with a solo practitioner by the name of Raoul Berger in his law office here in Washington. I wanted to come to the government, but there were no jobs, so I got a job with him. And then he closed his office in 1952 after the Eisenhower was elected president. He shut down his office, and he went to Harvard to do research. And I was then hired by Arnold Fortis and Porter in March of 1953 as a temporary associate to take the place of Pat Wald, who was, I had met Pat Wald at Yale, and she called me one day. I was without a job. She said, look, would I be willing to come over? And she was going to have a baby, and she said she was going to on maternal leave, and she said, would I be willing to come and just be, while she was on maternal leave, and take her place for 6 months. And of course I was delighted, and I came here. If they'd come and told me to mop the floors, I would have come. So anyway, so I came to, was then Arnold Fortis and Porter, and within a few months after I was here, they asked me if I would, they invited me to stay as an associate. And so I've been at Arnold Porter's for 60 years. I became then a partner, and I've spent my entire career at the law firm here. And it was, when I was the 12th lawyer, and now it's a firm of 1,000 lawyers. So I witnessed great development and change in the firm, been a part of it. It's been a great experience.
So what would you say was one of the highlights of your law career?
That's a good question. Well, there were many. Well, one of them was certainly my participation in the Gideon case. One day in the 1960s, Abe Fortis called me into his office. He was the senior partner here, and he said he had just been appointed by the Supreme Court to represent an indigent person whose name was Gideon. And he said in a case involving the question of, did an indigent person have the right to have a lawyer appointed to assist him? And he didn't. He said that's all he knew about the case, and he said he wanted me to assist him and supervise the research and so forth. And so I did. And we worked all summer with I had a group of people working with me, and Fortis really was the architect of it. He really, we gave him drafts of briefs, but he really wrote this brief. And of course he argued the case in the Supreme Court, and it became famous. It's one of the most famous cases of the last 60 or 70 years, Gideon against Wainwright, which established the right of every accused person, the right to have a lawyer. And at the time, we didn't know it was going to become that famous. at all, but it certainly did. And I then wrote articles about it, and I was invited for years afterwards to give talks about it. And in 2013 was the 50th anniversary of the Gideon decision, and all of a sudden I was getting calls from people all over the country asking me if I would come and participate, give talks or participate in panels and things of that sort. And because I was the only member of the firm here now surviving who had participated. Fortis, of course, he died in the early 1980s, and two other associates who'd worked with us had also died. One of them was John Ely, who was a very was a very distinguished constitutional scholar, became the dean of the Stanford Law School. He'd worked with me, but he had died. So anyway, so that was one of the highlights. But I had an opportunity. It was the time in Washington it was possible to do, unlike today when everything's so specialized, it was possible to do things in many different areas. So I had a chance to litigate things. I had a chance throughout the country. I did a lot of antitrust work, but I had a lot of other cases involving other agencies, the Federal Communications Commission, SEC. I was able to do a lot of very interesting things, a lot of other pro bono things. I was the president of the Friends of the Law Library of Congress at one point in the 90s. But I had a chance, because of the nature of practice at that time in Washington, if we were able to do a variety of very challenging and interesting things. Now less so because it's become so specialized, but then it wasn't. So anyway, I had a terrific experience here. But the atomic bomb story still remains still remains memorable.
Indeed. Is there anything about that experience that you think sort of guided you in future years?
No. I enjoyed being the editor of the Maroon. I was the editor of the Maroon for 2 quarters. And some of my successors were very distinguished. David Brody was one of my successors, who later became a columnist for the Washington. Very, very fine person, a fine journalist, outstanding journalist.
Over from you?
He was, I think, a couple years later at the editor of the Maroon.
So looking back, what advice would you have for young people today?
About what?
About whether they should, pursue journalism when they're young, or law?
Well, I never intended to be a lawyer. When I went to law school, I thought I'd be a journalist. That was my ambition. And we had no lawyers in my family, and I had no experience with lawyers. But when I got out of law school, I was broke, so I stumbled into being a lawyer. I would say a couple things. One thing was the University of Chicago experience left me with a lifelong conviction about the values of a liberal education. I think I'm not saying necessarily for everyone, but I think for a lot of people, I think that it's a terrific thing to have, and as opposed to a specialized or vocational education, a liberal education, and which was the tradition at the University of Chicago. And I'm a great believer in that. I think it just opens your eyes to so many things in the world, and enriches you just tremendously. The University of Chicago was one of the great experiences of my life, and I never forgot it. And so I remain convinced to this day that is still a desirable type of education for a number. I think there were a couple of things about the University of Chicago college education which I think I would have changed. I think I should have done better in math and sciences than I did, which I wasn't that interested. I think that's essential if you're going to be educated today, certainly, and even you have to have that background. And I think also that there could have been more emphasis on history than there was. But that's one thing I remain very, very persuaded about is the values of that kind of education, of a liberal education. And, you know, it can take different forms. There's no magic form of it. But I thought that the methods of education at Chicago, that is the classroom discussion, small classroom discussions, is a very, very fine way. Many years later, I was at Oxford, where they have a tutorial method. I was a fellow at Oxford, and that's a great method, but it depends on you having a good tutor, and also it's a very expensive way, and I'm not sure it's as good a method of teaching as a small class with discussion. But anyway, that's what. Secondly, as far as, I still think, contrary to what some of my friends and others think, I still think that the legal profession is an interesting, exciting, and challenging profession. I think there are exciting things to do in the law, remain so today. I think it's harder now than it was when I became it, because firms are now so large, many of them, and you get lost. But there are still very challenging and interesting things to do in the law, and there's enormous needs in the criminal law, for example, and other areas of the law where there are great opportunities to do exciting, challenging, and worthwhile things. So I still believe that. But I agree that it's tougher than it was. And if you go into a big law firm, the secret, in my view, is to have a mentor who will be interested in you and help you along. So I remain, you know, I still think that there are, contrary to what some people say, well, it's, you know, poo-poo being a lawyer, but I think I don't share that view.
It's wonderful. So is there anything that I haven't asked you about that?
No, I can't think of anything. I'm sure we've exhausted the subject of this and many others.
The University of Chicago is going to use this in their recruiting.
Well, I don't know about that. I remain I have great affection for the university, which I regard it as a very special place.